As I was thinking about this, what I would like to do, uh, I wanted to think about, a third path for third party as concerns racial issues. I've been unsatisfied with, to say the least, with the approaches people have taken on racial issues, and I think that there's a better way, a better path. And I didn't do this. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about for a decade or more. So this did not come as a result of me becoming more active and joining the American Solidarity Party. But I do think that what I'm going to propose fits in well with a lot of the values that we share in this party. Now, to be sure, if if some Democrat congressperson contacts me and says, look, I've heard this idea, I want you to present for the Democrats, I absolutely would do that. Likewise, if some Republican contacted me and said, hey, we're looking for a new pass, will you present this? I absolutely do that. So while I think this fits in with what the American Solidarity Party wants to do, this is an idea I would get out and I'll talk to anyone about. So a third path for a third party is what I sort of call this, and to hopefully help us to think outside the box as to different ways of looking at it. So let me sort of overgeneralize, if you will, but I think that this will resonate. As we think about racism, there's contrasting views. Now, what I would say is, for Republicans, this is what you're going to tend to hear, that racism is something that's overt and only done from one individual to another individual. So when you talk to Republicans, and remember I'm generalizing, I'm sure there's exceptions, what you're going to hear is we need to be colorblind. We need to stop. One of the things the whole conversation on right now is about critical race theory. And what Republicans are saying is that what critical race theory does is that it prioritizes people of color over whites. And what we should want is equality, where people of all races are treated the same, color blindness. And so this is the argument that Republicans are making. I think I'm really, I think I'm summarizing it in a fair manner. I think if you go to the average Republican person, because I've listened to individuals and talked to them, they will say something along these lines that I'm not looking to go back into slavery. I'm not supporting white supremacy. I just think we should all treat everyone equally. That's what's been called colorblindness. The Democrats, and here's what you'll hear from Democrats, that racism is structural as well as individualistic. And social institutions can perpetuate racism even when individuals do not intend to be racist. Now, one of the terms that you'll hear is anti-racism. The argument critical race theory, I'll talk to you all about that if you really want me to. I don't like to use that term. I prefer anti-racism. Anti-racism is a set of ideas on how we can combat racism. It's the focus on social structures. So whereas the Republicans say it's what individuals do to another, Democrats say it's our social structures, and we have to change the social structures. And so what is offered is a very proactive attempt to shape our social structures. For example, something such as the voting and voter ID laws. And Democrats will say, well, on the surface, that looks like that is fair. Everyone has to show ID. But the way our society is shaped, people of color are less likely to have ID than whites. And so it becomes unfair. We have to go in there and show and shape the structures. And part of that is to stop voter ID laws. All right. So these are two different ways, two contrasting views about racism. What I want to do is to look at them one at a time and show why I think both of them fail. And then I'll try to introduce something that I think is a third path that for you all for your consideration. First, is colorblindness viable? Now, colorblindness comes with the assumption that things are basically fair. That if we just ignored each other's race, then everything be okay. If things are not fair, colorblindness is not viable, because then to be colorblind is to be blind to unfairness. So the argument, whether they implicitly or explicitly state it, and sometimes they explicitly state this, is that we live in a fair society, and race does not matter except for a few races out there. And so when you talk to individuals, they'll say, yes, there are some races out there. Every now and then you do have a police officer go rogue, but basically our society is fair. Well, there's a lot of research that suggests otherwise. For example, this 2017 study shows there's been no decrease of racial discrimination in hiring over the past 25 years. And the way they got at this was they did what we call audit studies, where they would have a Black or Hispanic and then a white apply for a job, and then they see who would get response, who would be offered interviews. And what they found, and this is true over the past 25 years, is that discrimination against Blacks and Latinas has not decreased. They're less likely to be called back for the jobs, called back for the interviews. And when they apply for these jobs, by the way, they're careful to make sure that the applicants look the same, except for their race, and they avoid singling race. And this is a meta-analysis, so a lot of studies have gone into showing this. So what we know from this study is that if an African-American applies for a job, and people can tell this person is African-American, that person is less likely to get interviewed, all other things being equal. That's less likely to get the job. And that doesn't even say what will happen if they do get the job as far as promotions or anything like that. Another thing, which you might have heard of driving while Black, are African Americans more likely to be pulled over, all other things being equal? And this study, and there's some other studies that show, yes, it is. This study was done in Ohio, and 4 different areas of Ohio, looking at drivers and seeing how often they're pulled over and noting their speeds and all these other things. And if you're African American, all things being equal, you're more likely to be pulled over. And more likely to be pulled over, of course, could lead to other sorts of outcomes in the criminal justice system, more likely to be arrested, more likely to be convicted. There's other things that come, that sort of starts a domino going. That bias is already there, how that plays itself out. And there's other studies that suggest that it does play itself out. So our criminal justice system is not colorblind, according to research like this. Residential segregation, one thing that we know is that residential segregation is still very real. I don't know what cities you all are in, but if your cities have any sort of size, you probably have a Black area of town. I remember being in Wisconsin, and people said, there's no Black area of town in Madison, and we found the Black area of town. Well, what we know about residential segregation is that it impacts educational outcomes for people of color. They tend to go to schools that are not as high a quality. I happen to, and this is, long ago before this 2014 study, I went to a school that focused in on building and construction, whereas the other high schools in town focus in on college prep. So residential segregation still impacts the educational outcomes for people of color. And then in the age of COVID, this study is very telling. And they looked at about 39 different studies, and in 26 of them, they found evidence for racism in the beliefs and practices of medical health care providers. So it may be what tests are recommended, it may be their attitudes on how they believe about people of different races, but 26 out of 39 studies found evidence of racism in our healthcare system. So when you have that many studies finding that, one study, 2 studies, okay, 26 out of 39 shows that there's something there. So colorblindness matters or is viable if we have a fair society. None of this necessarily means that people are intentionally racist. We live in systems that are working against people of color. And therefore, colorblindness to a person of color looks very unfair since we live in a system that is not fair. Okay. Let's look at anti-racism. And let me define it a little bit first. One of the problems with all the talk on CRT lately is that it's really not defined and people don't know what we're talking about, or they're talking past each other. So let me define anti-racism. And this definition comes from having read a lot of the anti-racism books. So I was looking for themes, and so here's some of the themes that came out. Anti-racism is very proactive in approach. So you're not anti-racist unless you are going to be proactive. You can't just sit back and not be discriminatory, not be racist. You have to address racism. There's a focus on unfair advantages or privileges of being white. And so when anti-racists talk, we're trying to get a sense of their value structure. What they value greatly is dealing with unfair advantages, unfair privileges, white privilege, if you will, of whites. Some have talked about implicit bias indicating hidden racism. So even if you don't personally feel like you're racist yourself, you may have an implicit bias that comes out in what is happening. So that is part of why anti-racists are going to be proactive. You can't just rely on your own, I happen to not be racist, what do I need to do anything about this for? There may be an implicit bias that is there. Anti-racism talks about taking action to dismantle all aspects of racism. So it's not just individualist racism, it's also social structures, it's also, how our systems can perpetuate racism, to be proactive in dealing with racism and looking for racism and how it impacts us. One of the things you've heard in anti-racism is the term ending whiteness. Now, some people will say, well, are you talking about eradication? And to be fair, that's not what anti-racism is about. It's not about eradicating whites. What it is about is ending whiteness. And the way many anti-racists define whiteness is the sort of cultural norms and values connected to European American culture that have served to maintain the advantages whites have in our society. So in this sense, they talk about ending whiteness, ending these sort of cultural and normative values that they then connect to European American society. And there's an emphasis on listening to people of color rather than taking over. So whites, their job is to listen to people of color and not take over. And indeed, one of the aspects of anti-racism is a prioritizing of people of color over whites. And I intentionally say over whites, not with whites, over whites. Because if you read the literature on anti-racism, and I'll just give you one classic example. You may or may not have heard of white fragility, or read the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And in that book, DiAngelo talks about, what's the role for whites? And she says the role for whites is to listen to people of color, take what they hear from people of color and try to do better. The role is not to enter into a conversation, not to interject, not to complain, not to do anything but listen to people of color, take into consideration, try to do better next time.
Excuse me, George?
Yes.
I'm sorry. If you could click on the participants and let in folks.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. That would be great.
Let's see.
I'm.
How do I? Oh.
If you go to the bottom, or you can make and hit participants, I think it'll show you.
I hit admit all. So does that do it?
That should do it.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Now I know what to do.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay. So anti-racism. And I think I'm going to come back to that point because I think that's a very important telling point of anti-racism. And what I would say to someone said that I am exaggerating is to go look at the literature yourself and give me the anti-racism book where the role of whites is anything other than supporting people of color. And I'd be happy to read that book. But all the books I read, and I read several, in one form or another, that's what came out. So the question is that I ask as a social scientist is that, is this approach successful? In other words, we've had a lot of programs, diversity programs, some of them based in anti-racism, some of the efforts of anti-racism. Has it been successful? Well, here's one study that looks at remedies centered on justifying moving resources from whites and non-whites. And so this, when people say, look, what we have to do is take resources from whites and give to non-whites. And when that happens, according to this research, this produces resistance. So instead of whites working together, they resist. Now, you might say, of course they resist. You might even say they resist because they're racist. But I don't think that's fair. I think that this is a natural consequence of the sort of effort of anti-racism. That if you focus in on this as your motivation and tell people this is your motivation, the normal, natural reaction from people is going to be no. And so we get resistance, we get what might be called backlash to some of these remedies. People who will try to sabotage these remedies. Now, this is a meta-analysis. It's on diversity training, and not all of it's anti-racism, but a lot of it is. And the ones that are anti-racist, I don't think we've seen any evidence they do any better. But what we do know is that diversity training has little long-term effect on prejudice. What you'll get is a short-term effect, and then 6 months later, the effect will be gone. So we've done all sorts of diversity training, and yet we don't get any sort of long-term effect on prejudice. And here's another study that shows that if you compel whites to do anti-racism training, that this can create a backlash against people of color. So a lot of these anti-racism books are about how can you get whites to come in and do the work, do the training. Well, if you're compelling them to do that, what you're just as likely or even more likely to do is create a backlash. And going back to the current controversy over CRT, a lot of that, I think, is people feeling compelled. And so I think we're seeing a backlash against people of color. And then this one I found very interesting because there's a lot about white privilege and teaching about privilege. And this research, if you teach about privilege, what they found is that creates less sympathy for whites. We said, well, okay, well, maybe it increases sympathy for African Americans, but it doesn't do that. So what they found was that people who are already kind of progressive, they already were sympathetic towards blacks, and teaching about privilege didn't make them any more sympathetic. People who were more conservative, who were not that sympathetic, did not become more sympathetic. What happened was that people who were progressive became less sympathetic towards whites, especially towards poor whites, disempowered whites. So the sum result about privilege is not that you increase sympathy for marginalized groups, you actually decrease sympathy for marginalized groups that are white. There is very few studies that show this approach to be successful. The couple that I could find were small studies on, I think one was social workers and another one, I think medical people, professionals, very small studies, hard to generalize them out. And so there's really no reason to believe that anti-racism has the desired effect. And in fact, I think I'm going to go into another study where I'm going to show that these sort of approaches actually can make things worse. And some of this suggested that that's why I'm going to show something else in a little bit. So I think both these approaches fail. And ironically, I think they fail for the same reason. I think they both fail quite simply because they are attempts to make others capitulate to a predetermined solution. When you think about it, both of these approaches is, look, I'll just take the first one. Become colorblind and we will solve the racial problems. A few months ago, I posted on my Facebook page about raising my 3 black boys, or biracial boys, I'm interracially married, and asking people, well, how do you talk about racial issues with kids this young? And I got some advice, but I also got a lot of people saying, why are you talking about race? So I had people telling me on how to raise my kids and why I'm going to talk about race. Now, when you think about that, that takes some chutzpah. But what it also means is that these individuals feel so strongly about colorblindness, they feel it's not just good for them, it's good for everybody. And by golly, you should be colorblind too. On the other hand, anti-racism is also an attempt to make people capitulate to a predetermined solution. Read the books of anti-racism. They are basically saying, look, how can we get mostly whites to do the things that we want them to do? One of the books called, what's the name of the title? Why I Stopped Talking to White People. Basically white people aren't doing good enough. Other people need to talk to them and get them to do the right thing. All of these are attempts to make others capitulate to predetermined solutions. And here's where I want to introduce a third approach that is not about that, but about finding solutions that we can work together. And I call it a collaborative conversations approach. In the past, I've called it mutual accountability or mutual responsibility. I'm starting to like collaborative conversations a little bit though. I think that describes it a little bit better. And the way I think about it is working together to form healthy interracial communications so that we can solve racial problems. That's it. That's it. To form healthy interracial communications. And by that, we go to communications not so that I or you beat down other people for our solutions, but how can we solve healthy racial problems? How can we solve racial problems in a healthy manner? Now, I wrote an article, and they came on Christianity Today the other day, that I think will help me to introduce this a little bit, and it's about power versus moral suasion. And I wrote about what happens when you try to get people to do something that you feel that they should do. Now, one answer is, well, let people do whatever they want to do, and that sounds great until we think of certain situations. I mean, if a woman is coming to you and she's in an abusive relationship, you want her to leave that relationship or take steps away from that relationship. If you have a friend who is drinking too much or gambling too much, you want to help him to seek out help. So there are situations where we, as libertarians we want to be, when we are close to us, I want my kids to do certain things, okay? How do you do that? Well, there's two basic ways in which you can do that, and that's either using power or using moral suasion. Now, let me just admit that power at times is necessary. There are times in which we have to use power. If someone is snatching a purse and running away, I want a police officer to tackle that person and use the power to restrain that person. I myself, at least one time in my life, have used my power to restrain people who are fighting. Physically, I got in the way. I'm 6'3". I'm over 200 pounds. I got in the way and stopped the fight. I use power. If you have kids, sometimes you have to use power, especially when they're younger. Power at times is necessary. So my argument is not that we never use power, but power carries serious shortcomings. One of the problems with power is once you start using it, if you're not careful, it's hard to stop using it. So if we get a rhythm that we keep using power to get people to do what's the right thing to do, that's how we got to where we want to go, and that's what we tend to stick with. So there's serious shortcomings, and also power does not convince. When I got in the way to stop that fight, I didn't convince those people that fighting is wrong. It's just that you had a 6'3", 200-pound guy in the middle, and you can go through him, so you had to stop. But I didn't change their hearts or minds or anything like that. So I recognize that. It's just that it was necessary at that time. Moral suasion, not power, is necessary to produce lasting change. When you use power, and by the way, power can be defined a lot of different ways. It can be physical power, it can be legal power, it can be cultural power. If you don't do the right thing, we're going to cancel you in culture. It can be social power. So there's a lot of ways we can define power. But moral suasion, and by that, I mean convincing people morally the right thing to do, that produces lasting change. If I don't do something because you're more powerful than me, I don't do it, but I may want to anyways. If you convince me that it's wrong, then I may want to, but I won't because I'm now convinced that it's wrong. We use power to force people to change or to enact certain rules or regulations, and they don't like it. You may be able to force them in the short term, but a lot of times what happens is they'll start sabotaging. They'll stop working as hard for that change. They'll get in the way because they were never convinced. Moral suasion is what produces lasting change. And here's, I think, a very important part. Moral suasion builds community. Power builds compliance. Now, once again, Sometimes that's what we need, compliance. But when you get your way with power, you almost always set up those who are going to resist you. And so you're going to set up this resistance that's going to be fighting against you. But if we use moral suasion to convince people, then we're building community. We figure out compromises. We figure out how to work together, and we build community. By the way, let me just say this about moral suasion. Don't confuse moral suasion with images of a street preacher yelling at you or a college professor indoctrinating students. That's not true moral suasion. What research has shown is the way you build moral suasion, the way you convince people, you build rapport with them. You admit when they are correct. You find common values. You work with them. That's how you really do moral suasion. When people are trying to browbeat you, they're really not doing moral suasion. In fact, I would argue it's even a type of power. Cloud conversation is about using moral suasion instead of power. It's about coming together, figuring out how we can find solutions, how we can work together, build community, rather than my team's going to overpower your team and we're going to get our way and there's nothing you can do about it. And this is one of the reasons why I think that this fits in with a lot of what's done in the American Solidarity Party, because one of the things that attracted me about this party is an emphasis on building community. And that's what Collab Conversations is about. Is there any evidence that this is a good way to go? Well, there's some interesting empirical work on healthy interracial relationships. For example, we know that under the right conditions, interracial contact helps to alleviate bias. There are certain conditions that have to be met. So it's not just that if you're in contact with people, you're less biased. But under those conditions, if we feel equal with them, if we're working together, if we have support from relevant authority figures, we actually have less bias over time. We also know that having a common group identity increases positive feelings. And so if I feel connected because we have a shared identity with you, I'm gonna have more positive feelings towards you. On the other hand, if I see you as a member of what we call an outgroup, a group to which I possess scorn and alienation from, then I'm gonna have less positive feelings. So part of what we want, if we want to try to improve our relations with one another, is to increase the notion that I identify with you, that we're part of the same group. As much as we can do that, we can increase positive feelings and thus have less racial tension. And other research shows that families with what they call collaborative orientation have more positive interactions and relations with one another. So in this study, they looked at people who had what they call collaborative orientation, that they learned how to work together, as opposed to one that's more competitive. And probably not surprising that those that work together have had more positive interactions, have better relations. And that's in a family. What happens if that becomes a normative in our society? Will we not increase positive interactions and have better relations with one another? And then this is really interesting, that collaborative communications in an atmosphere of mutual support creates volitional compliance. And I think that's key, because I like to think about sustainable solutions, not solutions that we can get right now because we have the power, but solutions where people will work with us so that we can make the solution work. And collaborative communications, working in a collaborative way, actually creates volitional compliance. People are choosing to comply rather than feeling they're forced to comply. Now, I think one of the best ways to really look at the difference between a collaborative conversations approach and, say, an anti-racism approach is by this research by Dobbins and Kelvich. They did a very interesting study. What they did was they studied 829 mid-sized and large US firms. They documented efforts to increase minority representation among managers. And so basically what they were looking at is these firms wanted to have more managers who are people of color. They also looked at women managers too, by the way. They want to have more women managers, and the results are basically the same. Uh, so they document their effort. So what they did was they would look at what they were doing and then come back 5 years later to see if there's a positive potential effect. So they look at company A, document how many minority managers they have, see what they're doing, say goodbye to them, come back 5 years later and see, all right, here's what you're doing. Did you increase the number of minority managers? Did it stay the same? Did it decrease? So here's the teeth of what they found. When you use mandatory anti-racism training, you actually 5 years later had fewer people of color working as managers. So using mandatory training, train people and try and tell them, here's what we got to do, and we got to end whiteness, and we got to do this, that. 5 years later, you actually have fewer managers of color. What did work, and there's some other findings, and they fell along these sort of lines of trying to force people to do things. For example, this is also the case when they try to force people to give job tests when it comes to hiring. But companies that brought the white managers into a conversation about increasing diversity actually led to more representation. So for example, when they had the managers there who were mostly white lead up diversity task force or brainstorm on how we can be more diverse or become mentors to some of the people of color that were in these companies, that these things 5 years later led to more managers. Now, this is my conclusion, not theirs. They didn't go here, I'm going there. What happened, I believe, is that when you had this sort of conversation, you got better solutions because you brought everyone into there and everyone's needs could be addressed. And so you created an atmosphere that encouraged more people of color to actually be hired. When you try to force people through job tests or mandatory training to do certain things, you got resistance. And 5 years later, you had fewer managers of color. In fact, they do have some evidence that there was resistance in some of these efforts, and that's what led to fewer managers of color. So here we have almost a side-by-side comparison of a more anti-racism approach, an approach that looks at collaborative conversation, and the pure results is the collaborative conversation 5 years later, you have more people of color. So regardless of whether you like this approach or not, the results speak for themselves. Oops. All right, so I've talked about collaborative conversation and time does not permit for me to really go in depth into some of the steps of how we would use it, talk about active listening, things of this nature. But I will talk a little bit about a model of how you use to solve problems. Because one thing I want to be very clear that this is not about, holding each other's hands and singing Kumbaya and walking off the sunset together. This is about solving problems. Ultimately, improving race relations, absolutely. I think race relations would be improved a lot more if we did this instead of the other two models. But, when people are going to come back and say, well, we have structural problems. How's this going to solve that? So I want to talk about steps of using collaborative conversations approach, all right? So the first step to doing this is define the racial problem. You don't try to solve everything at once. I think most of us have been in relationships, and if you try to solve everything at, if you get into a disagreement with the person you're in a relationship with and solve everything at that time, you solve nothing. In fact, a technique some people will use if you're trying to solve one problem they don't want to talk about is to go off on another problem. So you say, this is what we're going to solve. This is the problem we're going to address. We're going to look at this particular problem. And ideally, if we can learn how to deal with this problem, we'll learn how to deal with other problems. But this is what we're going to focus in on. And then you identify the critical core. And what I mean by that is you identify that which you agree with each other. So if we're bringing in groups to try to deal with some particular problem, police community relations, or we're trying to deal with how do we have more representation in schools, how do we deal we're teaching our kids about race in the United States. If people don't want critical race theory, what do they want? How do we try to deal with sort of issues? Identify where you already have agreement. Remember that part of moral suasion is finding where we agree with other people. And then you recognize the cultural and racial differences at play. So obviously, we have some disagreements, or that's why we're doing this in the first place. So we try to recognize, all right, what's our disagreements? What are we disagreeing on? And here's where you have to engage in active listening, and here's where you have to really be very careful. It's not about arguing to win, it's about this communication to learn where other people are coming from, learn how we can approach other where they're at. And when we understand where other people are coming from, then we're in a position to develop ideas that address the concerns of racial outgroups. And it is very, very important that we know whatever idea we're going to come up with is going to address our concerns, just the way we are. We're going to make sure that the ideas that we promote address the concerns that we have. But if I know where other people are coming from, then maybe I could craft my ideas so they also address their concerns. And they can craft their ideas to try to address my concerns. And we can move closer to finding a solution. Because now the idea is not just what is good for my group of people. We're changing the question into what's good for my group of people to what's good for everybody. And that's a dynamic that's really not happening in our society. When we look at the Democrats and the Republicans. It's about how can we win for our side, not what's good for everybody. Work towards a solution to be accepted by all. One thing I would tell people is, you can fight to try to get 100% of what you want. And you know what? Every now and then, politically, you'll win. Every now and then, you may have the power to impose your solution. And what's going to happen is that 40% of the country is going to do everything they can to sabotage your solution. They're going to go on Twitter wars. They're going, they'll try to do exposés. They're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. They're going to do everything they can to destroy you. They're going to make protests. They're going to do everything they can. Now you have political power right now, but you got this 40% that's going to do everything they can to destroy you. Is that what you want? Or would you like 70% of what you want, but say 78% of people working for you? And probably that 70% is going to be what you really want, because if you're working towards finding the compromise, you're going to give up that which is not necessary to keep that which is necessary. And so if you can come to a solution where a majority of the country is going to work with you, not just a majority, a high majority, 78% is going to work with you because they have skin in the game too. You win politically, they have no skin in the game. Why not sabotage you? But now they have something they want, they're going to work with you too. What is the better deal? 100% is not stable, or 70% of what you most want, but it's going to be pretty stable because people are going to be working with you. So let me just touch on some implications of this approach, and then we can, open up for questions and say where y'all are at. First implication is no one has all the right answers, and we'll get better answers by listening to each other. Maybe that genius is out there who figured it all out. It's not me. I know that a lot of times I can get better answers by listening to others. Sometimes they get better answers by listening to me. So we come to this going, okay, I believe what I believe. I believe that this is right, but I might be wrong. So let me listen to others, and maybe I can come up with better solutions. We need intentional efforts at collaborative conversation. Notice I didn't just put conversations, because we get plenty of conversations that are not really conversations. We talk past each other. We try for monologues to dialogues. We need to be intentional about a collaborative conversation. Collaborative conversation where we're goal-oriented towards working with a solution, understand where other people are coming from, and find a solution that works best for the most people. Intentional. If you're not intentional, it's not going to happen. It's not going to just accidentally happen. It happens with effort. The needs of everyone must be respected. And what happens so much in our society is those who are colorblind don't really think about respecting the needs of people of color in general. And those who are anti-racist really don't think about respecting the needs of European Americans. And we can have our rationalizations why we don't have to, And you may feel, why should I have to respect these people? Problem is, if you don't, once again, they have no skin in the game. So it's actually not irrational. It's actually to be expected that they're going to do everything they can to stop you. And you get mad at them, but truth be told, if you wouldn't do this, people who agree with you will do this if the situation was reversed, and they got the power and they got to impose a solution. So that's, we got to respect everyone's needs. I didn't talk about active listening and productive communication. I have slides where I discuss how that's done. But let me just say that active listening is listening for comprehension, listening so that I can articulate what another person believes in my own words in a way they say, yes, that's what I believe. And just communication is learning how I can communicate to one way you can hear me, so that I know how to talk, how to communicate in a way that goes, okay, I understand what you're coming from. We need to develop those skills more in our society. We don't have them developed well enough. And we need to work towards solutions that are win-win instead of win-lose. We need to stop thinking about, I win, you lose. How can we both win? Because we both win, then we're working together. We're working in community together for the betterment of everyone. And so I think these are some very important implications of this particular approach that I think is something that we should really think about as far as pursuing. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. So I will throw out the share screen and then see if anyone wants to ask me any questions.
I've got questions.
Sure.
That I jump in real quick before. This is your talk has resonated with me. The one piece I feel like I'm missing is, what are the circumstances under which I would be able to have these collaborative conversations? I will just really briefly tell you about an experience I had recently. I'm a nurse, and over COVID, I was redeployed doing things that I don't ordinarily do. And one of the things was working in a facility. It's a motel that was used to house people who don't have a place to quarantine, and they needed nurses there. And for the first time in my nursing career, I worked with other nurses who were not white. I live in Seattle. I'll say that first off, and we're single-digit minority in Seattle, and in that setting, we're all working together towards a common cause, and in that case, I could find myself working very collaborative with everybody who was good nurses, and they were good nurses down there. But in my regular life,
Mm-hmm.
it would be like I might be at a sporting event and just sitting with the other parents, and so it's like where are the opportunities to practice this, to start solving some of these problems?
That's a very good question. And, like I said, that I had to shorten a lot of this for this particular presentation. I do talk in some of my talks about a collaborative conversation lifestyle. And there'll be certain components to it. One of which is trying to develop a racially diverse social network, and also trying to look for opportunities in that network and to take the risk to have these conversations in that network. One of the people that's hired me a lot is churches, where especially multiracial churches that have that sort of network. But most of us can develop that network. I know that Seattle does not have a lot of African Americans, but I do believe they have a pretty good Asian American population.
Yeah, okay, take that back. I've always worked with Asian and Pacific Islander nurses.
Yeah.
So
And in the day of the internet, we can develop relationships with people who are not proximity. So it's an intentional effort. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's an intentional effort. And then, there's other steps along the way in which we can sort of try to live a more collaborative conversation of lifestyle. And I use the term lifestyle because when you think about it, colorblindness is a lifestyle people try to live, and anti-racism is a lifestyle people try to live. So my argument is the more people live this lifestyle, the more we're going to have these conversations, because you're going to run across people who already, I am doing what I can to try to promote this. I have a book coming out in February that's going to deal with this more, trying to set up more opportunities, because this is off the radar screen right now. But in the meantime, we can at least try to create create our social networks, look for opportunities. Obviously, just because you have people of color in your social network doesn't mean that they're all ready to have this sort of conversation. You look for those opportunities to have those sort of conversations with people. And I believe that it will come up over time. It's just that, when a racial incident happens, if you develop a friendship with someone of color and they trust you a little bit, maybe just check in on them and just listen, just listen and start opening up some doorways that way. So it's not going to happen overnight or be easy. I think there are things that the government could do to facilitate that, but in absence of the government doing that, we have to do it on our own. We're going to have to start develop this on our own, and hopefully develop more and more networks that this becomes more normative.
Thank you.
I think I had a question, and it sort of piggybacks. I don't know if I answered my own question. When the conversation was first, when you mentioned collaborative conversations, my first thought was that, is this going to be simply teaching, where people are simply absorbing information that they may not do anything with? But it sounds like what is necessary is that there's a problem that you have to try to tackle. Like, this isn't just conversation, this is like problem solving.
Right. Yeah, the problem solving is a big part of it. Now, what I will say is, to get to that problem solving, we have to develop the rapport. And so ideally, and this may not always be possible, I understand, sometimes things come up and you got to just work with where you're at. Ideally, we've already developed rapport with people so that when an issue comes up, we can have that. And so it is important that we develop the relationship, but it's not just about developing relationships. It is about how we can solve problems. It's kind of like, if you're married, if there's a stress in your marriage and you have a good marriage, you all work it out, and it's not going to be easy, but you can work it out. If you have a bad marriage, that stress could tear the marriage apart. And so we do want to try to develop the relationships as much as possible, and then hopefully that'll help make it easier. Yeah. I'm not saying something easy, but easier when those issues come up.
That's good. I like that marriage analogy because it's relatable, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think of the two. I thought you did a really good idea identifying the color blindness and anti-racist. There's the marriage, and guess what? It's falling apart big time.
Yeah, because if you have a marriage where one person is constantly trying to make the other person compel them to do it their way all the time, those marriages are not good marriage. If they survive, they're not marriages that I want to be around. So yeah, I think that is something that we've learned over time.
Yeah, George.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Brian. This is really helpful, and I look forward to your book coming out. So I think one of the things that I look at this, and I think this is really what we need to pursue is this, what is the motivation? Because justice is real, but if our focus is only on justice and not on building relationships, then I think we've missed the mark. And of course, some people might not feel that or they might feel that my comment is easy for me to say, you know what I'm saying? that grieves me because I do want that relationship. You know, I have Black nephews and nieces in North Seattle area. I talked to my nephew, who's a pastor of a church in North Seattle. Last year, we had some good conversations, and I asked him. I just listened, you know, and he had shared his thoughts. But I feel like social media just makes things difficult, and I long to engage with people on this in a constructive way, and I need to pursue that. I need to do that. But it seems like when I share a thoughtful article, trying to find that middle road, oftentimes it's friends or relatives I know who are also white, who, in the desire to right these wrongs, and they're coming more from an anti-racism perspective, it's difficult because, and I'm trying to find my way forward here, because it seems like that somehow that the presumption is I no longer have the, you know, we no longer, if we're white, we no longer have a really a right to say something. We need to just listen. And and I know that there's areas in my heart that I really want to continue to be changed, because we all have that, you know, kind of knee-jerk reaction of fearing the other. And so, you know, I want to continue to become I want to love my neighbor, whoever that person is. But it does, I find myself, just to be honest with you, you know, what you're sharing about resistance, I find that in myself, that when, not because I don't want to change, but because if it's this almost like, well, there's this thing at play where the human nature says, well, I'll change, but if you have to change first, kind of thing. And so I think mutually pursuing this is really, really vital. Not because I shouldn't change first, but because it's about the goal, you know, and it just, I find it difficult to get past that point with some people, because but I don't want to deny, I don't want to act colorblind either, because I think I
like a lot of what you said. First, one thing that I've learned is that social media is not a great place for these conversations. You know, I used to be one of the keyboard warrior type, and I just have gotten to the point to, you know, unless I've developed some sort of relationship with this person, they're just a Facebook friend that I've just accepted just because, you know, hey, I don't know you, but hey, you're my friend. And they come in guns a-blazing, then it doesn't do any good to get into arguments. I mean, I'll post interesting articles out there and let people think about it, and I'll make interesting statements and let people have at it. But you know, social media is not, in part because you don't have that sort of relationship, and so that's part of the problem. That you know, this person, you don't even know them. They're you know, you're just typing at them. So. Also, I would say that, unfortunately, not everyone's ready for these conversations. And so one of the skills we have to develop is who is ready for it and who is not. And I'm just trying to learn to pick up those sort of cues. You know, is this a person that's really ready to have an honest conversation? And I will be honest with them, and I'll say, you know, look, you know, you may be right, but if you're not willing to even entertain what I have to say, then I'm not interested in just getting an argument for the sake of getting into an argument. And it's not that I fear arguments. In fact, I grew up, I'm an African-American, and we learned how to play the dozens. And so, unfortunately, I'm quite good at sort of, how should I say it, poking people. And, you know, I've asked God to forgive me for some of that, and I'm trying not to do that anymore. So sometimes the temptation is strong.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I remind myself, this doesn't do anything. It doesn't do any good.
Yeah.
And so I want to find the opportunities for the people who really, you know, who really want to have this sort of dialogue, or to facilitate this dialogue among others. And one last thing is, because of my position as a professor, and because I've done research, I've done interviews, and I don't want to come off cross like I got it all down, but I have listened to a lot of whites, and I actually think I know where a lot of whites come from, and I sympathize with some of them. I honestly do. You know, I think about Indian whiteness, that phrase, and whites get offended by that. I think, well, what if someone had a phrase Indian blackness? How would I feel about that? You know what? I would not feel that great about that. Maybe that's not the right phrase to use if you really want to get through to someone. And so I sympathize with, you know, with a lot of where my more conservative white friends come from, and they have some valid points. But having said that, you know, if I dialogue with them, I want them to also hear me out, and then we have a chance to maybe find some sort of consensus. And so, you know, we just have to learn who we got this conversation with and who is just simply not ready for it.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I want to build the empathy rather than you know, about being who's right. So
Yeah,
appreciate that. Thank you. Good thoughts.
thank you. And by the way, this is also a do as I say, not do as I do point, because I still fall short in this. This is not something, you know, I say this, and sometimes I'm fearful of saying this because, you know, sometimes someone's going to say, well, thou art the man, you're doing the same, you know, things you're saying shouldn't do. Because I'm not perfect in doing this either. So I just want to be honest and upfront about that.
Thank you.
So are you going on a book tour when your book comes out?
I wish I could do that, but you know, someone's got to stay home and take care of these boys. But yeah, I think the book will be promoted fairly well, though. The name of the book is called Beyond Racial Division, and it'll come out in February. So yeah, I think I'll do some radio shows, I'm certain, and I may do some speaking. But no, I don't plan on an actual book tour. Do they still do that? I mean, are there bookstores left for people to do that in, or?
In Seattle, there are.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Place books. They do all kinds of author readings. Yeah.
George, do you know of groups or individuals who have done parts of something similar to collaborative communications or other things? I'm thinking of, I remember friend suggesting a book called Building Bridges by, I think, Natasha Morrison.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if
Be the Bridge.
Be the Bridge.
Be the Bridge. That's the name of the book. Be the Bridge.
I'm not sure if that approach is similar or.
No, that's not something. There are groups that have at least nibbled around it. You know, there's a group in California called Game Changers that's nibbled around it. There's a group called Better Angels that not on racial issues particularly, but on other issues have tried to foster helpful dialogue. So, you know, I mean, you know, and maybe some of them are doing better jobs than what I'm describing. But there's some groups that are, none of them have blown up to really be really big. So the groups that people really heard about a lot. But there are some groups that I think are middle around it. I do know that there's a couple of other books that are somewhat similar to what I'm doing. And so I'm trying to help promote their books too, because I think if we can get more and more people talking about this, that's been part of what changes things. So anyways, so yeah, so there is some, you know.
Have you heard of James K. Smith?
No, I didn't think I have.
He's a philosopher. So he's done work in the area of education. But one of his analysis is that the way we try to disciple people as evangelicals has been short-sighted and ineffective. Because the way we try to disciple people is through ideas. We simply try to give people ideas, and we don't give them practices that they can embody and live out. And so, like, I was thinking, like, when Brian was speaking, talking about how people are trying to, I don't know, I had this image of people trying to convince each other of their perspective, right? But the problem with that is, even if somebody gets convinced of something, they'll say, okay, like for me, for example, I could say, oh, I'm convinced that it is good to be hospitable.
Mhm.
And that's a good and faithful thing as a believer. The problem is I don't have any practices that have shaped me into being a hospitable person.
Mm.
I intellectually know that it's good to be hospitable, but I don't have any practices to bring that about. So James K. Smith is saying that we have to figure out practices to educate us, to not educate, not yeah, to I don't know.
So
Yeah.
we have to figure out ways to do things so that people learn how to do them.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. So are there practices besides conversation? Like that's why I was thinking, the having a problem, a specific problem that you're trying to address
Yeah.
could be good because there's an embodied issue that you can both be working on
Yeah.
and trying to find a solution for. But are there other practices that would help with collaboration to build people to be collaborative?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I am trying to work right now on developing a workbook, but it would be, people meeting regularly to have conversations. And so ideally, and and the research does show that when you do diversity work, if you do skill development, then that is more effective than just, and kind of what you're saying, sit people down and having some diversity training come up and talk to them for 2 hours, that's not nearly as effective as having them develop skills. And so part of my thinking is I'm working on trying to develop a workbook where we can see where people are meeting and developing skills on how to engage this sort of conversation with people they don't know, but they meet with 6 times. I'm in the middle of trying to develop that right now. I'm trying to do some research to see whether or not it's effective or not. But that's somewhat along what you're talking about. So I'm not just telling you how to do a conversation, but I can, with this workbook, you can be led into doing a conversation. So that's kind of where you're coming from, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I could follow on from that just briefly. So George, so I'm actually a teacher. So two of us on the committee are of the American Solidarity Party in Washington are educators. And so that's an interesting thing too, of, from a position of influence, how can we take some of your thoughts and ideas? What would that look like on, say, with young people, elementary up to high school? I mean, high school is going to start to mimic adult life,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
young kids.
and for context, Brian teaches elementary and I teach high school history.
Yeah. I mean, here's where I think that it would be valuable if the government was behind this. What if we, without getting into the whole CRT debate, what if we emphasize teaching kids how to have conversations with one another, not just on race, but on all issues, where we try to find solutions rather than enter into combat. In other words, what we try to change some of the value system of our society by socializing our kids into doing this. I'm not, I teach college students, so I don't know how to teach elementary school. I don't know at what age this would begin. So I just will plead the fifth on that one. That I don't know. But what if we started doing that in our school system? Now, as you as an individual teacher, I don't know how much leeway y'all have to engage in that sort of thing. And of course, to engage in that, we really want to try to figure out where to get material for it. And there's not a lot of material out there yet on it. But it would be nice if the government would introduce that into our educational system, as opposed to some of the other things that are being introduced into our education system. I think we go a long way in lowering the temperature in our society if we talk to people how to, and that's not on racial issues even. I mean, political polarization, class polarization, all sorts of lifestyle polarization issues are there. We would teach people how to listen to one another and to engage in a more healthier approach. I think our society would be better off for that. So that's something that I've thought about.
Wow, that's good. Yeah, I think even that can start just by the grassroots. I mean, I think that's something I'd like to do more of and try this next year. I think that's never they're never too young to take steps towards that.
I mean, we kind of try. I mean, a lot of times we try to do that with our kids, anyways. I have a 6, 4, and 2-year-old. So when the 6-year-old, is bullying around his younger brother, how do you think he feels? Now, is there a power element to that? Yes. Sometimes, okay, you gotta go to timeout. I mean, he's 6, and so I can't totally use moral suasion, but I'm trying to start to use some of that with him and say, how do you think it feels when this happens with your brother? Would you want this to happen to you? So I'm trying to, as his father, hopefully have some connections and trying to engage some of that. And so, if we did more of that in the schools without a political agenda one way or the other, so we're not trying to bring in a bullying agenda because certain people, are bullies and other people are not. No, we're trying to teach all kids how to take the mind of the other. To consider others as good as themselves, and to try to find workable solutions. I think if we did that as a country, it would change our country for the better.
Okay. Hey, George, I have a practical question. So quick story is that I'm raised here in the Pacific Northwest, and I moved to the Midwest. And suddenly I'm surrounded by more African-American individuals than I've seen in my life. And my perception was that there was a lot of hostility towards me among that particular group when I would try to make inroads or be friends or that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that there's no reason to be hostile towards me. Maybe there is, that there's probably lots of, I don't know what's going on in the Midwest that would cause that, it could be anything, but how do you get past that on a practical level if you experience that?
Yeah, I think that goes back to, being able to decide who you can engage in a relationship with and who you cannot. There are unsafe people who are Black or white or Asian, who are Hispanic, Pacific Islander. There are people who are jerks in all those races. There are great people in all those races too. And so what we have to do is find, if we're building community, in our community, and our community is multiracial, then ideally we'll run into people in our community that we can engage in, and learn from, and they can learn from us. But I definitely would not tell people, hey, just any person of color you come across, they're going to be safe, because they're not going to all be safe. And by safe, I don't even mean physical safety. I just mean hostility. And there'll be a hostility that is not penetrable, and it's just there. I think it's unfortunate, but I think that we're better off being realistic about that.
Okay. Yeah, there were definitely exceptions. I was able to make some friends, but like in my apartment complex or at work, that there was just always individuals that were just hostile without talking to me. They just knew it was not going to make any progress. So
yeah, I guess obviously it can vary from region to region. The books that I'm talking about happen to be the other books I'm talking about happen to be written by African Americans. And so there is within the Black community those who want to have this, but obviously it's not true for all. It may not be true for most. It may not be true for most whites either, but there are those who are open to this sort of dialogue. Yes.
I think that's why we have to keep taking the first step, because if it's easy for all groups to feel like, well, maybe I'm not going to be trusted. So we need to keep making that first step of friendliness, and it may take a while before people, So they need to feel, because how do they know that we're safe? Yeah.
Yeah, true. Yeah, that is true. So yeah, until our society changes its values, I assume that I'm in the minority of trying to have this. So I'm looking for others who also have this perspective, and hopefully we can network and build and work together. But I'm not naive about that. This is not going to happen overnight. Even my book beats the New York Times bestseller list, it won't happen overnight. So listen, it's about 10:30 here, so I probably need to log off here pretty soon. But it's really been a pleasure meeting you all, and thank you for listening to me. And if you have any other questions, you can give them to Jeremy, and he has contact with me, and so I'd be happy to address them in that way.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And
And
it's
George,
really easy to
or,
listen.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, George.
Yes, thank you, George. Profuse thanks from us.
Thank you, and sorry I was a little late.
Very inspired, George.
Thank you. God bless you all.